The moment Elias Thorne saw the silhouette of the woman descending from the Missoula Express, he tightened his grip on the saddle horn of his heart. He'd spent 3 days rehearsing a rejection so sharp it could cut through the mountain frost. His sister, Abigail, had sent this solution to a problem Elias didn't believe existed. To Abigail, a ranch without a woman was a house without a soul. To Elias, it was a sanctuary for a man who had already buried his soul in the frozen earth 3 winters ago. He didn't want a mail-order replacement for Martha, and he certainly didn't want a witness to the slow, crumbling ruin of the Thorne homestead. He had promised himself with a cold and ironclad certainty that by the time the locomotive's steam cleared the valley, this woman would be back on the rails heading east. He stood on the platform of High Reach Station, the November wind biting through his canvas coat, looking every bit the granite-hewn survivor of a landscape that took more than it gave. But as Clara Vance stepped onto the weathered wood, her eyes, a startling clear grey that mirrored the impending storm, met his, and the rehearsed dismissals died in his throat. There was a quiet, unyielding dignity in her posture that made his planned cruelty feel small. He was a man who lived by the laws of the land, and the land was currently whispering of a winter that would not be survived alone, yet his pride remained a fortress he was not yet ready to abandon. In his pocket, the crumpled letter from Abigail felt like a hot coal. "She is a woman of character, Elias," his sister had written in that precise schoolmarm script that brooked no argument. "She is alone, as are you. The ranch needs a heart, and you need to stop living like a ghost among the pines. Martha would not have wanted you to turn into stone." The mention of Martha always felt like a fresh blade. He remembered the way the color had fled her cheeks when the mountain fever took hold, a sickness that moved faster than a hawk's shadow. He had spent those weeks in a desperate, silent war with a god he no longer recognized, only to end up breaking a shovel against ground so hard with frost that it rang like iron. He'd had to keep her in the cold house for 2 months until the spring thaw allowed him to dig deep enough to give her to the earth. To Elias, love was nothing more than a target painted on a man's chest for the heavens to aim at. He had built his life on a foundation of routine and solitude since then, convinced that if he let no one in, he would never have to stand over another grave. The train hissed, a serpentine release of steam that obscured the other passengers, a weary traveling salesman, a pair of rough-looking prospectors, and a local merchant, until only she remained. Clara Vance didn't look like a woman seeking a handout. She looked like a soldier who had survived a long campaign and was simply looking for the next ridge to climb. She walked toward him with a steady, measured gait, her dark wool dress frayed at the hem and coated in the fine grey dust of 1,000 miles. Her hair, a deep chestnut, was pulled back in a knot so tight it looked painful, yet not a single strand was out of place. She gripped a battered leather valise, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked. Her voice was lower than he expected, carrying a slight rasp from the dry air of the plains. Elias touched the brim of his hat, the gesture a hollow habit of a gentleman he used to be. "Miss Vance," he replied, his tone as cold as the mountain runoff. "I'm afraid there's been a grave error in judgment on my sister's part. I didn't authorize this arrangement, and I have no place for a stranger on my land. I'll pay for your return ticket east, along with enough for a meal and a room until the next train arrives. I apologize for the wasted journey, but I've no need for a wife nor a companion." He watched her face, expecting the usual collapse into tears or a flare of indignant anger. Instead, Clara simply looked past him toward the westward tracks where the conductor was already signaling for departure. "That's the Seattle line," she said quietly, her voice devoid of self-pity. "The eastbound return doesn't stop in High Reach again until Tuesday morning. That's 3 days from now, Mr. Thorne." The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. In his haste to purge his life of her presence, he had neglected the basic logistics of the frontier schedule. "The hotel in town is," Elias began, his mind racing for a way out that didn't involve his own front door. "I have 47 cents to my name, Mr. Thorne," Clara interrupted, her gaze returning to his with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I spent my life's savings on the passage out here, believing there was a home waiting for me. I'm not asking for your charity, only for the truth of the situation." A gust of wind howled through the station's timber frame, carrying the first sharp, stinging flakes of a true Montana blizzard. Elias looked at her, noticing for the first time the slight, uncontrollable tremor in her hands and the thinness of her coat. He thought of the man Martha had loved, a man who would never leave a woman to freeze on a platform with nothing but 50 cents and a suitcase full of shadows. He realized with a surge of resentment that he couldn't leave her here and still call himself a man of the Bitterroot. "The ranch is 5 miles up the valley," he said gruffly, reaching for her valise. "You can stay in the guest loft until Tuesday. I expect nothing from you and I'll provide the same in return. On Tuesday I'll drive you back here, pay your fare, and we'll consider the matter closed." She gave a single sharp nod, a silent contract between two people who were both, in their own ways, at the end of their ropes. The ride back was a harrowing exercise in silence, the wagon wheels groaning against the rime of ice forming on the trail, while the mountains loomed over them like silent, judgmental giants. When the Thorne homestead finally emerged through the swirling white veil, it looked less like a home and more like a monument to neglect. The white paint was peeling back like dead skin, and the porch had begun to sink under the weight of several seasons of unmanaged snow. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang of embarrassment as he saw his life through the eyes of a stranger. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of cold ash, stale tobacco, and the oppressive, muffled quiet of a house where no one had laughed in years. He lit the oil lamps, the flickering light revealing the thick dust that had claimed the parlor furniture like a slow-moving tide. "The room is at the top of the stairs," he said, gesturing with a stiff hand. "There's wood in the box and bedding in the chest. I'll be in the barn, tending the horses." Clara didn't complain about the cold or the grime. She simply moved toward the stairs with a ghost-like grace, pausing only to look at the kitchen, a room that had once been the heart of the ranch, but now sat as a graveyard of unwashed tins and empty jars. As Elias walked back out into the freezing wind, he felt the vacuum of his solitude being disrupted. He had built a fortress out of grief, but as he listened to the faint, rhythmic creak of floorboards above him, he realized the walls had been breached. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the terrifying weight of a living, breathing presence, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne was afraid of what the morning light might reveal. The second morning arrived with a sky the color of a tarnished silver coin, the frost on the window panes etching intricate, jagged maps of a world Elias no longer cared to explore. He woke at 4, a habit born of years spent tending to the relentless demands of a mountain ranch, moving with a practiced, silent stealth to avoid the floorboards that groaned like old men. However, as his boots touched the bottom of the stairs, the familiar, stagnant chill of the house had been replaced by something alien and intoxicating. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and the warm, yeasty bloom of rising dough. In the kitchen, the iron wood stove, a heavy beast he usually treated with indifferent efficiency, was roaring with a controlled, golden heat. Clara Vance was a silhouette against the flickering firelight, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her movements precise and devoid of wasted energy. On the table sat a plate of biscuits, their tops a perfect sun-kissed gold, flanking a pot of coffee that sent steam curling into the rafters. Elias sat down, the simple act of being provided for feeling like a physical pressure against his ribs. The first bite was an ambush of memory. It wasn't that they were a replica of Martha's cooking, but they carried the unmistakable weight of intentionality. In the harsh geography of the frontier, where calories were currency and warmth was a prayer, this level of care was a language he had forgotten how to speak, a reminder that a house could be more than just a shelter against the wind. After breakfast, the transformation of the Thorne homestead continued with the relentless pace of a spring flood. Elias retreated to the barn, seeking the uncomplicated company of his horses and the rhythmic labor of mending tack. But when he returned at noon, the tomb he had lived in was unrecognizable. The heavy velvet curtains in the parlor, which had remained drawn shut since Martha's funeral to keep the sun from bleaching the memories out of the rugs, were pinned wide. Pale winter sunlight poured across the floorboards, revealing grain and color he hadn't seen in years. Clara had found the lemon oil and the lye soap, scrubbing away the gray film of neglect that had claimed every surface. The mismatched dishes in the pantry were no longer a jumbled heap of porcelain and tin. They were organized with a schoolmarm's meticulous logic. Even the air had changed, the smell of stagnant grief and cold ash replaced by the sharp, clean bite of pine-scented water, and the faint, floral ghost of lavender from her trunk. It was as if she had reached into the past and forcibly dragged the house into the present. Elias felt a surge of irrational anger at the disruption, a feeling that his sorrow was being evicted without his consent, but underneath it was a terrifying sliver of relief. He watched her from the doorway, a woman who moved with the quiet economy of someone who knew that in the wilderness, idle hands weren't just a vice, they were a death sentence. By the afternoon of the second day, the friction of their coexistence began to generate a different kind of heat. Elias found Clara in the root cellar, standing before the final remnants of Martha's last harvest. She was holding a jar of preserved plums, her thumb tracing the elegant, fading script of the label. These jars were the last tangible evidence of Martha's labor, summer light captured in glass by hands that were now dust. His first instinct was to snatch the jar away, to protect that final vestige of his old life with a roar of territorial rage. But Clara turned to him, and her grey eyes held a look of recognition that stopped the words in his throat. It wasn't pity, it was the shared understanding of a fellow survivor who knew that ghosts were heavy burdens to carry alone. "These are still good, Mr. Thorne," she said softly, her voice steady. "It would be a waste to let them spoil. Would you mind if I prepared them for our supper? Using them doesn't mean forgetting the woman who put them there. It means honoring her work." Elias felt a hairline crack form in the fortress of his heart. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the coming Tuesday train, but he found himself nodding, a single sharp movement of his chin. That night, they ate the plums in a quiet harmony, the sweetness of the fruit a sharp contrast to the bitter wind howling outside, and for the first time in 3 years, the house felt like it was breathing alongside them rather than mourning. The third day brought a localized crisis that forced their burgeoning partnership into the light. A heavy support beam in the carving shed, weakened by dry rot and the weight of early snow, finally gave way. It was a task Elias had intended to tackle alone with a complex system of pulleys and stubborn, bone-deep exhaustion. However, as he struggled to set the new timber, Clara appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl he recognized as one of Martha's favorites. She didn't offer empty platitudes or ask permission. She simply walked to the upright and set her shoulder against it, her slender frame belying a surprising, wire-tight strength. Together they worked in a wordless synchronization, her bracing the weight while he hammered the iron spikes home. In the close, hay-scented dimness of the shed, Elias realized he hadn't worked this closely with another human being since the world had turned grey. "My father was a carpenter in the valley back east," she remarked, her breath misting in the freezing air. "He used to say that a woman should never wait for a man to do what she can do herself, because waiting is just another way of being a prisoner to circumstance." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not a replacement or a social obligation, but a person of immense, quiet courage who was carving her own path through the Montana timber, indifferent to whether the world approved or not. As the clock on the mantel ticked toward the midnight that would usher in the Tuesday deadline, the prospect of the return train began to feel less like a restoration of order and more like a looming tragedy. They sat by the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the newly polished walls. For the first time, Elias found himself asking about the life she had fled. The story that emerged was one of a respected teacher in a coastal city, a woman who had been betrayed by a man of influence and then systematically stripped of her reputation and livelihood when she refused to suffer in silence. "I chose the frontier because the mountains don't care about a woman's past, only her ability to survive the winter," she said, her hands busy mending one of his heavy wool shirts. Elias realized they were both refugees of different storms. He was hiding from the future because he feared more loss, while she was facing it because she had nothing left to lose. The silence of the house was no longer hollow. It was a space filled with the gravity of things left unsaid. When the distant, mournful whistle of a locomotive echoed through the valley, signaling a train passing through a neighboring town, Elias felt a jolt of genuine fear. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, the light of the fire catching the silver in her hair, and knew that if he let her board that train tomorrow, the darkness he had lived in for 3 years would finally become absolute. Clara froze, her back to him, her shoulders tensing against the biting chill that seeped through the doorframe. "The train is coming, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "And we both know there is nothing for me here but the shadow of a woman I never knew and a man who is too terrified to remember her." Elias stepped into the light of the kitchen, his boots heavy on the floorboards she had scrubbed until they shone. "I am afraid," he admitted, the honesty of it feeling like a raw wound. "But I am more afraid of what this house becomes when you aren't in it. Stay for a week, not as a wife and not as a burden, but as a partner in this struggle against the mountain. Let us see if we can find a way to live in the present instead of the past. If after 7 days you still wish to leave, I will drive you to the station myself, and I will ensure you have enough to start a new life wherever you choose." Clara turned then, and for the first time, Elias saw a spark of something other than weary resignation in her grey eyes. It was a flicker of hope, so fragile it looked as though a single breath might extinguish it. She studied his face, searching for any sign of hesitation, before slowly setting her valise down. "1 week," she agreed, her voice steadying. "But I will not live in the shadows. If I stay, you must speak her name. You must let Martha be a part of this house again, or I will never truly be here at all." The fragile peace of the Thorne Ranch was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when the rhythmic, high-stepping gait of a horse echoed in the yard, a sound that didn't belong to the heavy-set workhorses of the Bitterroot. Elias emerged from the barn, his rifle held loosely but ready, to find a man who looked entirely like a poison in the rugged Montana landscape. He was dressed in a tailored wool suit with a gold watch chain glinting against a silk vest, his dark hair slicked back with expensive pomade that smelled of cloves and arrogance. This was Julian Vane, the man Clara had fled in the east, and his presence felt like a cold fog rolling over the ridge. He dismounted with a practiced feline grace and strode toward the house as if he already held the deed to the ground beneath his boots. "Clara!" he called out, his voice smooth and carrying the entitled ring of a man used to owning everything he touched. Clara appeared on the porch, her face turning a ghastly shade of white as she gripped the railing with knuckles that went as pale as bone. Elias stepped between them, the barrel of his rifle pointed toward the dirt, his intent unmistakable. The arrival of the city man brought with it the crushing realization that the past was never truly buried. It simply waited for the right moment to come back and claim its due, armed with the weight of gold and the cruelty of a wounded ego. "I've come to bring my property home," Julian said, offering Elias a smile that was as cold and sharp as a razor blade. He looked Clara over with a proprietary gaze that made Elias's blood boil with a protective rage he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "This little rebellion has gone on long enough, Clara. Your departure was dramatic, I'll grant you that, but surely even you can see the absurdity of staying in this God-forsaken wilderness with a common laborer who smells of pine pitch and failure." Clara's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of iron. "I am not your property, Julian. I broke that bond the moment I found the truth of your character." Julian's expression hardened, the veneer of civilization cracking to reveal a calculating mind. "Our families had an agreement, and more importantly, your brother had debts that my father was kind enough to settle. $3,000 to be exact. If you do not return with me to Philadelphia, I will have the territorial authorities arrest you for theft and fraud. You are a pauper, Clara, and in the eyes of the law, you belong to the people who paid for your survival. You have 30 days to reconsider. Either you come back and fulfill your obligations, or you spend those 30 days in a territorial prison before being sent back east in chains." He tipped his hat to Elias, a final, mocking gesture of superiority, and climbed back onto his horse, leaving a silence that tasted of ash. The threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. $3,000 was an impossible sum, more than the entire value of the Thorne Ranch's livestock and equipment combined. Elias watched the way Clara flinched, the way the old fear began to cloud her eyes as she realized the cage she had fled was being rebuilt around her by a man who valued her only as a trophy of his influence. But as the sound of Julian's departure faded, Elias felt a different kind of fire igniting in his chest. He realized that the money wasn't just a debt, it was a ransom for her soul, and he would not see her sold. "We are going to town," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble of defiance. and we aren't going there to surrender." They rode into High Reach the following morning, the sky a bruised purple that threatened the first true blizzard of the season. The ceremony was a sparse, hushed affair in the back room of the territorial office, conducted by a harried magistrate who smelled of tobacco and old ink. As Elias slid a simple silver band, one he had purchased in haste from the local jeweler, onto Clara's finger, the world seemed to settle into a new, permanent shape. "In this territory, a wife's person and her past are protected under her husband's name," Elias explained, as they filed the certificate. "You are no longer a Vance seeking refuge, you are a thorn, and Julian Vane will find that my name is not something he can buy or break." The first week of their legal union was an intense, wordless period of recalibration, where the house itself seemed to be breathing in a new, unfamiliar rhythm. They had moved Clara's meager belongings into the master bedroom, a space that had been maintained as a silent shrine to Martha for over 1,000 days, now suddenly disrupted by the scent of lavender soap and the soft, rhythmic rustle of another person's presence. It was a delicate dance of shadows. Elias found himself watching the way the lamplight caught the determination in Clara's profile as she mended his heavy woolens, while Clara navigated the rooms with a quiet respect for the ghosts that still lingered in the corners. However, the domestic peace was merely a thin veneer over a growing sense of dread. The 30-day ultimatum issued by Julian Vane ticked in the back of Elias's mind like a rhythmic hammer against an anvil. He spent his daylight hours reinforcing the ranch's perimeter and checking the action on his Winchester, knowing that men like Vane did not retreat simply because a piece of paper had been signed in a dusty territorial office. The air in the Bitterroot Valley grew heavy and expectant, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the first crack of lightning that would signal the start of a storm that couldn't be weathered with silence alone. The silence of the valley was finally shattered on a Tuesday night, not by the predicted blizzard, but by a sickening, pulsating orange glow that bled across the southern horizon. The frantic, heavy pounding on their front door pulled Elias from a shallow sleep, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the headboard. Silas Reed, their nearest neighbor and a man whose family had worked the land for 2 generations, stood on the porch, his face a mask of soot and terror. "The barn is a torch, Thorne," Silas gasped, his voice raw from smoke and the cold. "The wind is pushing the flames toward the house, and Sarah is trapped in the upper crawl space with the smoke. I need every hand that can carry a bucket, or I'm going to lose everything before the sun comes up." Elias didn't waste a second on questions. He grabbed his heavy coat and boots, but as he turned to tell Clara to bar the doors and stay behind, he found her already dressed in her thickest wool, clutching a leather satchel she had prepared days ago, filled with clean linens, salves, and tinctures of willow bark. "My mother was a nurse in the camps back east, Elias," she said, her grey eyes flashing with a fierce, cold light that matched the steel of his own resolve. "You fight the fire to save the timber. I'll fight the damage it does to the people." They rode hard through the biting darkness, the glow on the horizon expanding until it looked as though the very gates of the abyss had opened in the middle of the valley. The scene at the Reed Ranch was a chaotic sensory nightmare of screaming livestock, billowing black plumes of ash, and the terrifying guttural roar of a fire that seemed to possess a hungry, sentient mind of its own. The main barn was already a towering inferno, the dry hay and aged timber fueling a heat so intense it singed the hair on Elias's arms from 50 feet away. He immediately joined the bucket brigade, his muscles screaming as he hauled heavy iron pails from the well, passing them to the line of men desperately drenching the roof of the main house to prevent the sparks from taking hold. Beside the well, Clara was a blur of competent, focused energy. She transformed the back of a wagon into a makeshift triage station, treating the agonizing burns of the ranch hands who had risked their lives to drive the horses from the burning structure, and tending to Sarah Reed, who lay convulsing with the effects of smoke inhalation. The heat was a living predator, mocking their puny human efforts with every gust of wind that sent a fresh shower of embers onto the dry shingles of the homestead. As the first grey light of dawn began to peek over the jagged mountain peaks, the fire was finally reduced to a smouldering skeletal heap of charcoal and white ash. The Reed house had been saved, but the cost was staggering. The heart of Silas's livelihood had been erased in a single night of violence. It was in that moment of exhausted desolation, amidst the smell of charred earth and the sound of quiet sobbing, that Elias noticed a detail that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Just past the edge of the blackened earth, near the north fence line, he caught the brief, unmistakable glint of a silver-mounted saddle in the distance. A lone horseman was watching the carnage from the shadows of the pines, and though the figure was obscured by the drifting smoke, Elias knew the arrogant posture of that rider. He walked toward the fence, his boots crunching on the frozen grass, and found exactly what he expected: a discarded kerosene tin with an embossed mark from the High Reach Hotel and the deep, narrow tracks of a high-stepping city horse. This wasn't an act of God or a tipped lantern, it was a deliberate message, a declaration of war against the very idea of a community that dared to protect someone Julian Vane claimed as his own. The men of the Bitterroot gathered in a somber, soot-stained circle around the ruins, their faces reflecting the grim reality that the frontier code of mutual survival had been violated. Jake Morrison, a man who spoke rarely and never without purpose, looked at the kerosene tin in Elias's hand and then at the tracks leading back toward town. "A man who burns a neighbor's barn to settle a personal score isn't a man at all," Morrison spat, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "He's a predator, and there's only one way to deal with a predator that comes into your yard." Elias looked at Clara, whose hands were stained with soot and the blood of their neighbors, and saw the same iron resolve mirrored in her expression. The trial by fire had ended, but the true battle for the soul of the valley was just beginning. They were no longer just a widower and a refugee trying to survive a Montana winter. They were part of a collective that had been forged in the heat of the Reed's barn. As Elias mounted his horse to lead the procession into town, he knew that the time for hiding was over. Julian Vane had tried to burn their world down to ash, but he had failed to realize that some things only grow stronger when they are tempered in the flame. In the grim, frost-bitten dawn following the fire, the men of the Bitterroot Valley did not wait for the slow, rusted wheels of distant bureaucracy to turn. Elias Thorne, his face still etched with the soot of the Reed barn and his knuckles raw from the bucket brigade, led a silent, single-file procession of riders into High Reach. They did not come with the frantic energy of a lynch mob, but with the cold, undeniable weight of frontier truth. In his saddlebag, Elias carried the scorched kerosene tin found at the fence line, its distinctive markings tracing back to the very hotel where Julian Vane was currently enjoying an expensive breakfast. Marshal Cobb, a man whose skin was as weathered as the Montana shale he patrolled, met them on the hotel steps. He took the tin, listened to the quiet, damning testimony of the ranchers, and felt the collective temperature of the valley rising toward a boiling point. "Money can buy a great deal in the East, Mr. Vane," Cobb stated as he confronted the man in the lobby, his voice echoing against the polished timber walls. "But out here it doesn't buy silence, and it certainly doesn't buy safety from a dozen men whose lives you've tried to turn to ash. In this territory, we don't judge a man by the gold on his chain, but by the salt in his sweat and the honor in his word." Vane, stripped of his gilded arrogance by the unyielding stares of the men he had dismissed as laborers, realized for the first time that his influence ended where the mountains began. While the men handled the physical evidence of the arson, Clara Thorne was fighting a parallel battle of intellect and ink. She spent the next 48 hours at the telegraph office, her fingers flying as she dictated urgent queries to the Philadelphia Board of Education and the very banks Julian's father claimed were owed thousands. The responses that trickled back across the wire were a series of devastating blows to Vane's fabricated narrative. There were no signed contracts, no legal liens, and certainly no standing for a man to claim a woman as property for the supposed financial sins of her kin. Clara compiled these documents with the same meticulous, unwavering care she used to mend Elias's shirts, creating a fortress of truth that no crooked lawyer could breach. When the territorial judge, a man who valued the expansion of the territory over the whims of Atlantic aristocrats, reviewed the findings, he didn't just dismiss the claims against her. He issued a formal protection order banning Julian Vane from the territory under threat of immediate imprisonment for fraud and attempted manslaughter. The last the valley saw of the city man was a hasty, unceremonious departure on the eastbound express, his fine wool suit wrinkled and his pride scattered like grey ash in the relentless Montana wind. The threat was gone, but the victory was quiet, leaving a space where fear had once lived. Spring arrived late that year, the snow finally surrendering to the sun in a messy, jubilant flood of mountain runoff and new emerald grass. The Bitterroot Valley transformed from a monochromatic wasteland into a vibrant tapestry of life, and with the thaw came a new kind of rhythm to the Thorn Ranch. The oppressive silence that had once defined Elias's existence was now a relic of a darker era. One morning, as the first wildflowers began to pepper the East Ridge, the house was filled with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very timber of the walls, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn. Clara had labored through the night with the same quiet, iron-willed strength she had displayed on the train platform, and as the sun crested the jagged peaks, she placed a small, dark-haired girl into Elias's trembling arms. They named her Hope, a word that had once felt like a cruel mockery to Elias, but now felt like an anchor in a storm. He stood by the window looking out toward the solitary oak tree where Martha was buried, and for the first time he didn't feel the jagged edge of guilt. He felt a profound sense of continuity. He wasn't replacing the life he had lost. He was honoring the fact that love, much like the Montana soil, was capable of producing a second harvest if one was brave enough to plant the seeds in the wake of the fire. As the years unfolded, the Thorn Ranch became more than just a place of survival. It became the heartbeat of the local community. Elias and Silas Reed, their bond forged in the heat of that devastating night, worked together to establish a local cooperative that protected smaller homesteaders from the predatory tactics of land speculators. Clara, never content to be a mere observer of history, used her background in education to establish the valley's first formal schoolhouse, teaching the children of the frontier that knowledge was a weapon just as essential as a fast horse or a sharp plow. The house grew alongside the family, with two more children, Samuel and Martha Grace, filling the rooms with laughter and the beautiful, chaotic noise of a life lived to the fullest. Elias often found himself watching Clara from across the yard, marveling at the woman who had arrived with 47 cents and a broken heart, only to build an empire of affection. They were no longer two strangers trapped by a 3-day deadline. They were a testament to the idea that a mail-order beginning could blossom into a legacy of genuine, hard-won devotion. The shadows of the past had not disappeared, but they had retreated to the corners, providing depth to a picture that was now brilliantly illuminated by the present. 20 years after that fateful November day, Elias stood once again on the platform at High Reach Station. The town had grown, the wooden planks replaced by sturdy stone, and the mournful whistle of the locomotive now sounded like the heartbeat of a thriving territory. He was waiting for his eldest daughter, Hope, to return from her own studies in the east, and as the train pulled into the station, he felt a strange, beautiful sense of circularity. Clara stood beside him, her chestnut hair now shot through with elegant silver, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. They looked at the mountains, the same jagged peaks that had once seemed like prison walls, and realized they were now just the borders of their home. "My sister was right, you know," Clara whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder as the steam from the engine billowed around them. "About what?" Elias asked, looking down at the woman who had saved him from the tomb of his own making. "About Martha. She would have wanted you to find the light again. She would have wanted this." Elias squeezed her hand, his heart full of a peace that had been decades in the making. He finally understood that memory wasn't a prison. It was a foundation. You could love a ghost and still hold the hand of the woman standing right in front of you, moving together toward a brand new dawn.